Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony. This Saturday bonus episode is a recording of an interview we gave on another podcast. Regular Words and Numbers episodes come out each Wednesday.
I'm going to talk about this thing, the knowledge problem. And I usually start this by asking high school students what that might be. And of course, there's always some wiseacre in the front row that says a problem with knowledge. And yeah, that's right. It's that. But it's a certain kind of thing. And in order to understand it, I want to bring you back to ancient Athens, where a guy who you've all heard of, and maybe some of you have studied him quite a bit. I know I've spent a lot of my nights with Socrates, walked the earth. And, it's a miracle. Athens was miraculous, right? Because Socrates taught Plato, taught Aristotle. These three, and these are all intellectual giants. They all lived in a big city, Athens. But that big city had about 140,000 citizens. It wasn't that big by our standards. And to see these three people emerge from one plot of land that's so relatively small tests our understanding of probabilities and outcomes. But Socrates, as many of you know, was, I think you're all adults here, I can speak plainly, was a world-class pain in the ass. And he was a pain in the ass to everyone he dealt with. And what ended up happening was he would go up to people and bother them and say, tell me what the answer to this question is. And that got old after a while because he wouldn't let these people go until they had given him something sufficient or something that he could say, see, you don't know. And he was not beloved as a result. And, as a result of that, he was gathered up by his fellow citizens, thrown in jail, put on trial, and executed. All right, so before that, he did have a bunch of very good friends. Guys like that often do. And one of them, Coercion, went to this place, the Oracle at Delphi, which was the most important religious site in the ancient world, overseen by the most important woman in the ancient world, the Oracle herself. And the story went that you could ask the Oracle a question, she would fall into a trance, all the smoke and the mirrors would come next, and don't you know, she would come out of the trance and answer your question. I do not speak of the veracity of this approach, but it was an approach that everybody there at the time bought into. And Coercion asked her, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And here she is in an artist's rendition, doing what she does, getting into her trance and communicating with the gods. And she came out of the trance, looked at him and said, no, there is no one wiser than Socrates, at least leaving open the possibility that there could be someone as wise. But this became problematic because Socrates came and said, some variation of this. This is an apocryphal quote. You don't find it anywhere in translation. But he says things a lot like this everywhere else. So I think it's fair enough to say this, but it's not true. Socrates knew plenty. He's trying to get you to think about humility in the face of all you don't know from the perspective of what you do know. And I take this very seriously. I didn't when I was younger, and you could well imagine I knew everything when I was 18. It's a lot harder now that I don't know anything. And it seems to get worse every year because the more I learn, the less I know. And you have to kind of be humble there. I don't know how you could not be. I wake up every morning thinking, all right, how will I get through this day? I don't know near what I want to. So I want to ask you, just broadly speaking, if you think he shares in this kind of humility. And all right, if you don't like him, we'll talk about him. Doesn't matter to me any. And matter of fact, we can talk about him, or any other politician from dog catcher right on up. Is it possible to know enough to tell people how they must live? And ultimately, that's what politicians do. So do they know enough? And in order to answer that question, I'm a trained political philosopher. I specialize in the history of political philosophy from Plato to Nietzsche. So you'd think I would go back to those people to analyze this question, and I don't. I go to an economist who wrote one of the very simple things, so accessible anyone could read it and understand. And it's Leonard Read who writes I Pencil in 1958. And we're really just talking about a standard pencil. And he picked a pencil for a pretty good reason, right? It's a relatively simple thing, and yet it has constituent parts. So there are 6 different things that you would need at least to make a pencil. You'd need the graphite, which is also, most people don't know, mixed with clay. So that's 2. You've got the wood of the shank, that's 3. The aluminum of the ferrule, that's 4. The eraser, that's 5. And the paint, which would be, so at least 6 things. And it's a strange thing, a pencil. I'm actually a pencil aficionado. I don't know if any of the rest of you share with my lunacy here, but I have so many pencils in my house, I don't know what to do with them. And one of the reasons why I have so many is because I keep stealing them. And I'm not going to advise you to steal anything, but I'm going to advise you to steal pencils. So deal with my cognitive dissonance on this. Because here's what happens. You walk up, you grab a pencil, you look at it, and you leave. And nobody ever chases you away. Well, why on earth is that? Well, the only reason that can be is that they're just not that expensive. We've got them and they're functionally free. My father once asked me what a CD-ROM cost. I didn't have the first idea how to answer him. He got very angry with me and I said, look, man, you're asking me what a paperclip costs. I don't know, but it's kind of nothing, more or less. And nobody ever chases me down for a pencil. So I have these 2 gigantic boxes in my office at home filled with them. There's probably over 1,000 pencils in there by now. And I plan on stealing 5 or 6 here at the Sphere Summit. And yet Leonard Read said, there is not a person walking the earth right now, nor has there ever been a person who could make a pencil by himself from scratch. And that observation sat me up a little bit when I first heard it. And I thought that might not be right, Leonard. Maybe it's the case that lots of people can make pencils. And it turns out they can't. I could only, I think, get the clay. I couldn't get anything else. And the trick here is the by scratch part. So realistically, if I'm making something from scratch, I have to get the wood first. That would be my goal anyway. And to get the wood, I would need a tool to cut down the tree. And to cut down a tree, I would need an axe, and an axe has a wood handle. And I'm in a loop that I'll never escape from that point forward. All right, so fair enough. Pencils are boring. I know that they're my things. Toasters. And I always ask students when I talk to them about this, how much does a toaster cost? And there's always some guy down in the front row that thinks a standard toaster costs like $150. I don't know where they get these answers, but this is the Walmart cost for a Sunbeam toaster. It's even a toaster that's so good you could toast a bagel in it. And remember, a toaster has but one function. It burns bread. It's the only thing it does. It burns it to your desired level of burntness by that circle there, the knob. You turn it where you want, and there it goes. So can you make a toaster by yourself from scratch? Well, maybe not, because that's a lot of things going on there. And here's a toaster disassembled so you can get a better idea of what it takes to burn bread, right? This is a very simple thing that it has to do. And yet, as I look at that, I don't think I could get a single one of those things together by myself from scratch. So here's where it gets really interesting. This guy, Thomas Thwaites, an artist from the UK, got it in his head that he was going to build his own toaster from scratch. And you could imagine how well that went, right? He did offer a toaster up. This is him. I'll give you a closer view of the toaster. All right, so the toaster doesn't pass any aesthetic test whatsoever. But if you look at it carefully, you can tell that he's cheated, right? It was supposed to be from scratch. That plug on that unit all the way to the left, that's not made from scratch. That's purchased or pirated off some other device. Those copper wires also, he didn't make those. I'm sure he didn't. The plunger I've always thought was a piece of rebar with a hacksaw. I don't know that for a fact, but it looks like that in a way. And the plastic is interesting because it turns out he needed to to heat the ingredients to such a high level that he couldn't build an oven of any kind that would accomplish that. So he ended up mixing a bowl of ingredients into his microwave. And you can see that it comes out rather homely. This is what it looks like taken down to its basic two-stage part. On the right, the housing, on the left, the guts. And you can get a better view of the plug there on the left. Turns out this didn't work all that well, as you could imagine, right? And as you look at it, it's just ridiculous. And it becomes more a point of discussion than an object for use. And don't feel bad for Thwaites. He wrote this book, The Toaster Project, and did all kinds of book tours. He made himself a pretty nice living here after the fact. But this was actually a very expensive undertaking. And it cost him $2,360, not including the labor cost. It took him almost a year to make this thing, from thought to execution. You know, I don't know how you come to terms with this when you can go right back to Walmart and get yourself a Sunbeam toaster, if they still make Sunbeam toasters, for $9.91. This is a very inexpensive thing, and they tend to last nearly forever. I threw away the toaster that somebody got me for my wedding as a wedding gift right around my 24th anniversary. That's how long toasters last. All right, so maybe this is not the right way to look at the problem. Maybe we should look at food. My daughters, I have two, one's 21, the other's 18. They often tell me that they cook from scratch. And Andy George here, he wants to make a sandwich from scratch. And my daughter, I remember the first time she told me she was making something from scratch, it involved pasta. And I looked at her and said, "You're a liar." And she had taken the entire day to make the pasta from the dough. She made the dough the whole bit. And I said, "You're a liar. You didn't make anything from scratch." And she said, "Of course I did. Look at the machinery I just used." And I said, "Where did you grow the wheat to make the pasta?" And she looked at me like I was an idiot, which I understand. But Andy George wanted a chicken sandwich with honey mustard dressing. He did, in fact, make that sandwich, referred to it as pretty good, not great. But here's Andy growing the wheat. And he's a multimedia star. You can go look all this stuff up if you like. Okay, he's growing the wheat. And he's still cheating because he didn't make the rake. Look at it. It's got a metal part. It's got a wooden part. He didn't make that. He didn't make the bucket off to the left. He didn't make the plastic bags in front of the bucket. And he didn't make the shovel on the other side. And there's a bunch of other stuff here that I can't identify because it's sitting too low in the grass. Honey mustard, remember. Well, if you want honey mustard, you're going to have to contend with bees. Bees will kill you. So you need this suit. Andy didn't make the suit, and he didn't make the building that you see in the background. He didn't make the chicken, although I don't know that you can make a chicken. I just put this slide here to make this realistic, right? There's a lot more to a chicken sandwich than most of us would be willing to stomach. And there it is. And the sandwich cost him $1,500, not including 6 months worth of labor. That's Andy George, if he were hungry, he'd be dead by the time he'd made the sandwich. And that's a little strange, right? Because if you think about it, sandwiches, toasters, and pencils all cost so little that we would go out and replace one without giving it a second thought, or walk into a restaurant. And whenever I think how expensive is a sandwich, I hear the $5 footlong song from Subway. Right? I just can't shake it. And now I think it's $6. So whatever it is, it's not terribly expensive. So why are we talking about these three things? And the very fact that they're so inexpensive is most of the reason why. And when we think about human activity, we generally see the world in two radically different ways. On the one hand, we think of market mechanisms, the thing that delivers us the sandwich, the pencil, the toaster, and all of the information that gets wrapped up in a price. It all happens behind or well away from our point of awareness. I don't know what it takes to build a toaster. I mean, I know what all those parts are, but I don't know who makes it. I don't know how many people are involved. I know none of that. What do I know? Costs about $15, give or take. Pencils, You can get a box of 12 for about $1.50. These are the things I know. So I can look around at a store and say, I want that, go get it if it's affordable to me. Central planning, on the other hand, is how we view almost all political things. We look to somebody to lead us out of the wilderness, and every year, every 4 years, you hear people promising the moon and the stars, only to wait 4 more years and get all the same promises, no matter who won the last election. And there's a lot of coercion that goes in central planning. There's a lot of cooperation that goes on in market mechanisms. So in order to understand maybe how this all works, I want to think about the place on the planet where central planning was tried in the most aggressive way possible. And I don't want to talk about whether it's evil or not evil. I mean, that's a conversation for another day. I want to talk about if it worked, because that's really what matters first. And when I put the Soviet Union's map up here, some of us are going to be old enough to remember it, some of us not. But you're going to mostly, if you've done any research on this, you're going to think largely the same things. And it's that almost everything these people wanted was at the end of a very long line, because they didn't have supermarkets like we do. They had distribution outlets like this. This was the milk line. Here's the groceries line. And I've picked pictures from throughout the Soviet Union's history, so we're not biased by generation, at least. Here's the liquor line, which really means it's the vodka line. But look at that last guy. He knew he was going to be in for a wait. He brought a book. To buy liquor in the United States, I don't know, a credit card in about 2 minutes. That guy was in there for the day. And then you think, this is the one that everybody always talks about, the bread lines. And it's pretty long. And I work with a Russian, so when I have questions like, why the hell is the bread line so long? I go and ask him, and he said, oh yeah, the bread line was the one line you could get in that you could pretty much bet that when you got to the front of the line, there would still be bread behind it, that you were going to get the bread. The other things, it was a crapshoot. You're probably not going to get any of them, but bread you could get. And here's the meat line. And you notice that it's just variations on a theme. And then in 1959, a glorious thing happened. Khrushchev, the first Soviet premier to visit the United States, came, and they brought him to a grocery store in San Francisco, Safeway. And he walked in and was floored by what he saw. Now, keep in mind, this is the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, very likely the second most powerful man in the world after the American president. And he couldn't fathom what a grocery store was. And his first question was, who can come here? Because he thought that the answer would be political elites. And the answer was anyone who wants to. And he didn't believe it. He demanded they take him to another one. Imagine that. A man of that power can't even imagine what a grocery store is like. That means nobody in the Soviet Union can imagine what a grocery store is like. Nothing really changed as a result of this. However, 30 years later, Boris Yeltsin came, and things were disintegrating in the Soviet Union at the time, for those of you who remember. And Yeltsin went to this small market, this was in St. Louis, and took a look around and said, this is unbelievable. And he said, I'm going to bring this home to my people. They will have this too, because he knew that everybody was going here, and regular people could have access to this kind of thing. Back home, what did he say? Even the Politburo doesn't have this choice, not even Mr. Gorbachev. So literally no one, no matter how powerful, had that choice. All right, so let's unpack that for a minute. I always do this example with high school students. We have a high school program we go visit. So get in touch with me later if you'd like us to come to your school. We come at no cost. No cost to you, I should say. But I ask young people, say, all right, look around the room at your friends and look at their feet. Tell me what you see. And again, that same guy who tells me it's a problem with the knowledge also tells me shoes. I see shoes. No kidding. Tell me about the shoes. What conclusions can you draw from looking? And come to find out, it's always different by gender. There's women's shoes and men's shoes, and then a big, vast pile in the middle that are unisex. They're different in terms of color, in terms of size, in terms of materials. It turns out they're different in a lot of ways. And why is that? Well, it's because we all have different preferences, and the market tends after us as we chase after our preferences. Somebody decides, I'm going to make cowboy boots out of leather, and he sources the leather and the rubber and the stitching, sources everything from all over the world, puts them together, and he's taken a tremendous risk. And he offers them for sale and sees if somebody wants them. That's how markets work, right? And the price is the signal to tell you whether it's worth it or not. The shoe lines in the Soviet Union were the longest line for any product. Shoes, who would have thought? I just would have assumed something that you eat, but that would be incorrect. And this is a shoe line in the Soviet Union. And I want you to notice the women's shoes as they stand in this line, because they're red herrings. They don't belong there. And you'll see why in a minute. Now, in the United States, we had Kinney shoes and Tom McCann shoes, nationwide shoe chains. And what do you see here? A woman doing her window shopping. She could walk in through that open door. Notice the door is open. Tell the clerk what she wants. He can go get it from the back room, bring it back, charge her, she could pay, and be on her way out the door in a matter of minutes. Exactly the opposite of what happens in the Soviet Union. Matter of fact, you can see that social trust in the United States is so high at this time that you can put your product outside the store and nobody will come and steal it. Rather strange, actually. And these are the shoes you can get in the Soviet Union. There's actually a repository of pictures of Soviet shoes. There weren't many varieties. There weren't many sizes. They didn't use different materials. That same Russian, I showed him this, and he said, oh yeah, I had these when I was a boy and we lived in the Ukraine, Siberia, excuse me. He said it got so snowy and so cold that we had to ski. We had a cross-country ski to our school. And that thing you see in the front is the lip that snaps into the skis. Who would have thought? I can tell you that whatever they are, you don't want them. I mean, these look like torture devices. So this looks terrible. They did a little better with military items, but not enough that you chase after it. And what ends up happening here, why is that line biggest? Well, it's interesting because at the height of its population, Soviet Union had about 287 million people. And that same year, they produced 800 million pairs of shoes. That's 2.5 or so pairs of shoes for every man, woman, and child. I have never in my life, I think, bought more than 2 shoes in a year. And in the last 5 years, I haven't bought any. Why on earth is the shoe line the longest? And it come to find out, it's longest because it was intermittent. And it came when outside shoes appeared in the Soviet Union. And they were typically in the black market, they were from countries with leather making traditions. So Portugal, Spain, Italy, these places. Those shoes would get into the Soviet Union and people would get wind of it. They would wait as long as they had to wait. And remember those women that I pointed to that had really nice shoes that didn't look anything like this? They always knew when there were shoes from these places to be had. So if you can't plan shoe production, how can you plan anything? Or it's a little depressing when you think about it. And I have to ask, is there an alternative? And again, I end up looking at economists. I'm not going to ask if government can be non-authoritarian. It can't be. It is by definition an authoritarian endeavor. But can it be less so? And I turn to Hayek every time, who defines, I'm not going to bother reading this out loud, you can read it just fine, who defines economics this way. And I would just call your attention to how many qualifiers are in this easy sentence. Can we actually do much of anything? Well, I'm not so sure. But I do see that Hayek and Socrates are in the same universe, right? They're both telling you that ignorance defines the human race. Socrates gave up on it the minute he said that was the end of his consideration. But Hayek took it a step further. And he, I think, unpacked this whole thing for us. Because of spontaneous order, he said, we don't really have to worry about insufficient knowledge. We all have insufficient knowledge. We're all ignorant in most respects. But that doesn't mean that we as the human race is ignorant at all. And we're not, right? So I can't make a pencil, a toaster, or a sandwich. Well, I can make a sandwich, but you take the point. I can't make those things, but those things exist. Why? Because we can make those things. And if I ask high school kids to give me an example, they can't. It's everywhere, Hayek tells you, but you can't see it. And it's kind of like asking a goldfish to describe water, right? You're not going to have a lot of luck with this. So I give an example, just one, and it's deaf children in Nicaragua, early part of the 1980s. This was 1981. They had always been a very poor country, and their economy started working appropriately at about this time. And they did exactly what all decent people do when there's more money available than there ever was before. They started looking around and they said, how can we take care of people who can't take care of themselves? They started with deaf kids. And they moved them all into what we would call an orphanage. The first one had 50 young people in it. They were mostly young. And the first thing they did when they got there, because it's a perfect illustration of human nature. Well, the first thing they did was look around and they were amazed at what they saw. The second thing they did was try to communicate, and they couldn't because they were all deaf. Now, they had never seen other deaf people before, which had to be a wonderful moment for them, knowing that they weren't alone in their world. But they started wandering through their environment, pointing at things and giving them signs. And they, within 2 years, had given everything they saw a sign. Not only that, abstract ideas, verbs, verb tenses, adjectives, adverbs, every single thing that makes a language, these 50 young people have developed all by themselves with no direction whatsoever. It's still being used all these years later. It came to be known as NSL, Nicaraguan Sign Language, as we have ASL. So I want to think about language for a minute. Who invented English? We could probably say this guy had something to do with it, but it's an idiotic question I ask. Nobody invented English. And you can tell that what we really have is an evolution, right? Because here is Shakespeare. I don't like Romeo and Juliet. Richard II is perfectly fine. And if you read this, if anybody reads this, high school students, they could actually summarize this and do a pretty good job. They're going to miss some of the finer points. But this English and our English, not that much difference. Let's go back a little bit. These are the opening lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now I'm not sure what's going on at all. And I read a lot, right? I should know. And I can tell you a few things. I see March and April listed, which means it's probably a springtime thing. I can see eating and drinking here. And that means it's probably a celebration that everybody lived through the winter. Best I can do. And it's depressing to think about that. But in the amount of time from Shakespeare to us right now, these words were all added to the Oxford English Dictionary, which means that these are now standard English. When I would circle this nonsense on papers and write a big X through it and write substandard in the margin, well, now I can't do that anymore. And I have to admit, I'm a linguistic purist to some degree. I don't like that it continues to evolve, but that's just tough luck on my part because it does. And that's interesting. And my daughters, I have a son too, he doesn't say much. My daughters at dinner will have a conversation that I cannot understand. And I remember doing that to my parents when I was their age, and I suspect they will do it if and when they ever have children too. So I want to get us all the way back to kind of where we started. Markets versus central planning. I really don't want to talk about markets after all. It's not that interesting. What I do want to talk about is spontaneous order in lieu of markets, because I think spontaneous order is absolutely fascinating. And it gives us all manner of wonderful things. And just to give you a real world application, it's a college campus for you. And you can see that it has very unusual sidewalks. It has unusual sidewalks because they weren't laid at the time the college was built. They waited, and they waited to see where people wanted to walk. And this is where people wanted to walk. How did they know? There was a path everywhere they looked. They just paved over the paths. And look at the grass here now. It's not damaged in any one place, right? There's obviously not a walking path here beyond the paved ones. So Can government be non-authoritarian? No. Can it be much less authoritarian? Actually, yeah. And that's the tricky bit, because when you look at this, I always tell people, I can tell you that 100% of one or 100% of the other are not going to get you anywhere. What you need is something in between. And that to me doesn't yield a clear, convincing answer. So my suspicion here is that you have to have some trial and error and some decisions that are more overt than we typically have to figure out where on this continuum you fall. I can't tell you where you fall. I can tell you where I fall. And I'm kind of towards the left, but not all the way. And that's really the best you can do to solve the knowledge problem. And I'll stop talking now.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, James. We do have a little bit of time for questions or discussion points. If anybody has anything they want to chime in, you can also just type it in the chat and I'll read it out loud, or James can end up reading it.
No, I can't see the chat from here, but I've got this podcast with my partner, Anthony. And if you like this sort of stuff, we talk about it quite a lot. Feel free to come, and you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. Happy to have new friends anytime I meet anybody. So.
We do have a question from Matt. So what types of activities are more appropriate for central planning?
Well, I think whenever you see infrastructure, I think you have to point at that and say, look, I don't see much of a way that a bridge is going to appear here just because we all want one. And, you think of something like the Hoover Dam, something that really took a lot of planning and a lot of effort. And there are all kinds of things in these categories. And I think that you'll find them largely done by state governments, not so much by the federal government. Maintaining a military. I don't see this as being something that we're going to work on in anything approaching a spontaneous order environment. So any kind of infrastructure, any big giant thing, we probably have to do what we have to do. Now, on the other hand, there are a bunch of things. So you could talk about the Federal Register, right? The number of pages that we all must conform to. Started in 1936 with 6,000 pages, give or take. It got to a height under Obama. It got to 180,000. Trump had this math that people had to do that for every one thing in, two had to come out. So it decreased in volume a little bit. But what you found is that what got taken out was things that were no longer relevant anyway. But we're all looking at like 140,000 rules and regulations that have to be followed. And I know I have two great examples. One is at a park in San Francisco. If you bring your dog there and your dog does what dogs do and poops on the ground, how you must pick it up and where you must dispose of it is specified in the Federal Register, which seems perfectly idiotic. On the other side of the equation, if you want to build a spaceship and travel off the Earth, there are rules against such a thing. Imagine that. There was this guy, you might have saw him. He was in California. He was a flat earther. I tend to think these people are crazy, but what can you do? And he was building a rocket, and he lived in a trailer, and he put the rocket like this, resting on the trailer. His goal was to shoot up 5,000 feet in the air so he could look down and see if the Earth was curved or not to his own satisfaction. Never really thought about how you can buy an airline ticket for $300 and be at 35,000 feet really easily. But the Federal Register covered what he was doing too. So these sorts of things, I think, get kind of silly. And if you look at regulation and you think, wow, did we really need that? And your answer is probably not. That's really what I'm talking about. Do we need every code that we have? And I think no matter what the code looks like, you'd have to conclude no. And then you'd also have to conclude that we probably do need it with some things that we don't have it with. But when you get the errors out of the mix, you're still left with a big chunk of things that we're really better off taking care of on the local level. The Catholic Church refers to it as subsidiarity. The American framers referred to it as federalism. The idea is that you push decision-making to the lowest possible point. And if something's local, it's not state. And if something's state, it's not federal, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that's at least somewhat sufficient.